And now, the counterpoint. So I'm very happy to be in this session, and in fact, I agree with much of what was discussed earlier, to be honest, but I also disagree with a few other things. So imagine me coming to you now as a kind of physicist fresh out of the egg, and I'm being asked to give my impressions of this whole phenomenon, this whole kind of realm of UAP. So, thanks for having me here, and thanks very much to the organizers for giving me an opportunity to think about something that I don't normally think about, and to dive into something that I don't normally study. And I was asked to join you as a physicist working in a completely different field to give my take on unidentified anomalous phenomena, or UAP. And so my completely different field, of course, is experimental particle physics. So I'm a particle physicist working on the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, where I've worked for more than 10 years as a member of the ATLAS experiment, as was mentioned, one of the two collaborations that discovered the Higgs boson particle in 2012. And as a reminder, the Large Hadron Collider is an experiment inside a 27-kilometer circular tunnel, about 17 miles, on the border of France and Switzerland, about 100 meters underground. And in this tunnel, we use superconducting magnets colder than outer space to accelerate protons to almost the speed of light and smash them into each other millions of times a second, briefly recreating the conditions of the universe as they were just a fraction of a second after the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago. Because understanding what was happening back then will help us explain the universe we have now, and could help answer the biggest open questions of science related to dark matter, the Higgs boson, the matter-antimatter asymmetry of the universe, and the relative weakness of gravity, among others. Now, CERN is completely open to the public, and all of our research is conducted purely for the sake of curiosity. It's the very opposite of classified. It's basic science for the public good. We're not making products, we're not making profits, we're not looking for energy sources, and we have nothing to do with militaries. All of our research regularly captures the attention of the public, usually in good ways. In addition to my research, for many years I've had a separate role as a public-facing scientist, and so I travel the world speaking on stages and online about science and society. And I think at this point I've heard nearly every possible conspiracy theory about CERN that exists. Some say we're causing skips in the space-time continuum and branching the world into different timelines, and we're thus the cause of the Mandela effect. A fan down there, Mandela effect fan. Yeah, Mandela effect. Which is a psychological phenomenon related to the way humans process information. Some say we're controlling the weather. If only we could. Others say we perform satanic rituals because there's a poetic sculpture of a Hindu deity, a gift from the government of India, on our campus somewhere. Now, the people that peddle this conspiracy theory, for some reason, the fact that they have an equivalence between Hindu and satanic does not bother them. Others say we're trying to make antimatter to make a bomb. Still others say we're opening a Stargate portal to hell. It's like something out of a 90s sci-fi movie. This is literally something people ask me about. These ideas are patently absurd, and in the course of our research, they don't merit attention at all. This is because they are wholly unrelated to our research and the questions we're trying to answer. They do not follow from the observations and open questions in the field. Now, I mention this because as a physicist attempting to be a constructively critical observer from another field, I see similar things within the realm of UAP, things that can be identified as, to me, prominent impediments to building a robust, modern, international scientific study of these phenomena. Because if the things on the left are things that do not follow from observations in experimental collider physics conducted at CERN, here on the right is a list of things that, in my estimation, and in the estimation of many other scientists, do not follow directly from UAP. The first is the existence of extraterrestrial civilizations. I warn you, this talk will either annoy you or really inspire you, or maybe both. I see UAP and the ET hypothesis as two different things, and this is similar in mindset to what Beatrice was mentioning earlier, and other people mentioned the kind of hesitance of physicists or the mainstream scientific community to give any kind of assent to this realm. And I see it as two different things because and I see them as actually scientifically they would benefit from being two different subjects. For UAP, the most important letter in that acronym is the first one, U, unidentified. There are many unidentified things in science. And it's not valid to jump from U to ET in the complete absence of observations of extraterrestrial civilizations. Now, I see ET research as that done at SETI and by Avi and his colleagues, et cetera. And for this talk, when I talk about UAP, I'm mostly limiting myself to those UAP reported that have been seen on Earth in the atmosphere, although I'm aware of the reports of those in water and multimedia type of reports as well. But the fact that a significant number of people in the UAP realm either have already concluded the ET hypothesis is correct or quite handily arrive at that conclusion as an explanation for UAP is in fact a major impediment toward an independent global scientific study of the topic. So when someone describes an experience they had or a medal they said they saw and it seemed weird to them, and they follow that by saying it was definitely not made on Earth, that statement doesn't necessarily follow. Opinions, feelings, and ill-defined measures of plausibility do not constitute convincing scientific evidence. Witness reports without further hard data in the physical sciences broadly scientifically amount to hearsay. And the fact of governmental obfuscation is not equivalent to hard data for scientists to analyze. So another set of conclusions that do not follow are that UAP are caused by or related to deities, demons, devils, angels, ghosts, goblins, etc. That is, the supernatural. Keep in mind that the supernatural does not exist because if it did, it would be natural. These are in the realm, I told you this might annoy you. These are in the realm of the patently absurd and fundamentally meaningless conclusions and phenomena on the side of the CERN conspiracy theories. The fact that a significant number of people in the UAP realm mention such things in the same breath is another impediment. Now, another set of things that do not follow from UAP are psychic phenomena, whether this is mind reading, remote viewing, precognition, the paranormal, mind-based spoon bending, astral projection, or what have you, regardless of those who say that they have had experiences with these notions, either personally or for the military, which are completely valid personal experiences. The overwhelming scientific consensus is that there is no evidence for the objective existence of these things. All of the claims of such phenomena have either been demonstrated to be false or fraudulent, or have not been replicable in independent studies, or the effect observed has been shown to be no better than that resulting from random chance. The even tacit connection between psychic phenomena and the paranormal and UAP is another impediment. So related to psychic phenomena as well as another thing that does not follow from UAP. Consciousness as a field that permeates the universe and somehow has something to do with the zero-point energy of the quantum vacuum. I'm aware that there is a lot in that sentence. But suffice it to say that the concept of a universal consciousness field is not within the realm of justified established science. And entertaining such notions when discussing UAP is another major impediment. Now, there are a few other things as well, but I'm belaboring this point because it's important that you understand where I'm coming from. The fact that I'm here at this symposium means that I would, of course, be happy to see a broad, modern, open, independent, international scientific study of UAP with broader buy-in from a wider swath of scientists, or of any anomalous phenomena. But to get such participation, one needs to be brutally clear about what is and is not science within this realm. Now, discussion of these things that don't necessarily follow contributes to scientific suspicion toward the entire enterprise, and as it has for decades, because these ideas, as benign as they might seem to some, are too often of a part with other more harmful conspiratorial and pseudoscientific ideas, for example, in the realms of public health or the climate crisis, and they are still poison for the vast majority of scientists. Now, science, despite what some people say, isn't actually about debate, and it isn't a belief system, and it isn't about telling stories. It's about, as you heard earlier, data and evidence. Now, I wanted you to understand where I'm coming from, because the reason I'm here is not to scold, nor to lecture, nor to speechify, well, perhaps a little bit of speechifying, but to give my take on two things. So, under the assumption that some of the reports of UAP represent real, currently completely unexplainable craft, and under the assumption that some of the behaviors and movements of some of the UAP reported are real, what could possibly physically explain these behaviors and movements? And then second, if I were asked to design a scientific research strategy to fully understand UAP and to potentially explain some of these behaviors and movements, what would I recommend? Now, before we get into it, again, all of these caveats, we need to address that first assumption, because in fact, for many scientists, it's still a rather large assumption. So my take on this assumption, the assumption that some of the UAP reports are describing completely unexplainable craft, is that it's not currently scientifically justified. And I think this because there is a prominent lack of the following: objective, controlled, robust, repeatable, reliable, clear, unambiguous visual data that constitute convincing evidence for UAP that are available to the broader scientific community. There are a lot of qualifiers there because all of those things are actually needed for a comprehensive scientific approach. Now, despite a very large number of reports stretching back to the 1940s in the kind of modern era, the broader scientific community still lacks this kind of unambiguous, direct, non-hearsay data. There are lots of reports and plenty of information like radar readings and things like that, as well as a very large number of frauds and hoaxes, but the existing corpus does not constitute a good basis for a comprehensive scientific study. The main sources of data and the main observations are, at best, vague and inconclusive, and at worst are clearly and prosaically explainable with known objects and phenomena. And eyewitness accounts, even from witnesses of whom we have no reason to doubt the credibility, are simply not equivalent to repeated visual data and physical objects to study. Now, to be clear, this is not to dismiss or denigrate those who have observed and reported currently unexplainable things. And it's not to dismiss the actions of those who have chosen to expose the dissembling and obfuscations of government entities, but the fact of government lying does not lead to some of the conclusions on the previous slide. Governments lie all the time, both for nefarious reasons and also for perfectly banal reasons. The crux of a scientific attitude toward anything is that in the absence of clear data supporting the existence of some explanation, we withhold our assent to this explanation representing reality. That's not a bad thing, it's a very good thing, and it's why science is successful. To eventually arrive at a modern scientific study of UAP, this is the attitude we must take. The umpteen thousand recorded reports are quite often fascinating and extraordinary, and as you know, 95% of them can be explained with known objects and phenomena. The fact that 5% of them cannot currently be done, or at least have not been yet, as we discussed, does not logically lead to any of the conclusions necessarily that we listed on the previous slide. They are currently simply unexplained. Now, the main evidence for UAP that has been presented to me and to the world has been in the form of photos and videos such as, such as those that were leaked and then acknowledged to be real, such as the famous FLIR video, the gimbal video, the Go Fast video, etc. Now, the phenomena shown in these videos are, as I mentioned, honestly most likely prosaically explainable, and are honestly quite opaque and somewhat indecipherable, and frankly, much of the time they don't display the behaviors that are present in some of the more extensive descriptions by purported eyewitnesses. And this is not to ignore the large amount of putative scientific analysis that has been conducted on UAP over the decades, but overwhelmingly the various official studies by various governmental bodies around the world have been successful at simply establishing one thing, that some unidentified things exist. That's not a controversial statement. But then, unfortunately, they far too often directly conclude that this implies, say, the ET hypothesis, which, as I mentioned, doesn't really directly follow. Again, my role here is not as a curmudgeon or a debunker. I don't have time to be a debunker. I have my own fascinating research to do, my interest in which never diminishes. I'm a physicist, and as a physicist asked about any physical phenomenon, one should ask such questions and make such critical observations. Another critical observation you've heard before, probably repeatedly, and the reason you've heard it all repeatedly is that it's still valid. If there are hundreds or thousands of UAP reports every year, and 5% are unexplainable, and a decent number of those were purportedly seen by multiple observers, then the lack of a large number of clear, repeated photos and videos of them is surprising. It's simply not valid to say that UAP are shocking to humans and that everyone who sees one is too stunned to pull out their phone. Everyone pulls out their phones to take photos of everything all the time. It's a collective instinct now. And there are more than 7 billion smartphones on the planet. This lack of this kind of data is significant and a significant drawback. UAP are big, visual, macroscopic objects that human beings have apparently been seeing and reporting for decades, if not longer. So clear, unambiguous visual data are what is needed for UAP. And perhaps this will change with the various plans to place sensors around the globe, and perhaps with the Operation Skywatch, which we heard about yesterday, which is a really great idea. And if there are secret materials and files and photos held by governments, then by all means convince those governments to release them. The scientists would love that. But without clear data, it's very difficult to mount a broad scientific study. So now that we've discussed this assumption, which I have told you that I don't think is justified, we can dive into the behaviors and the movements themselves and to the physical phenomena that could possibly cause them. The physics, which is ostensibly why I'm here. These things are not contradictory to me because I love gray areas, and physics has a long history of enlightening thought experiments. So, the first kind of behavior that is often described is that of some object, either large or small, hovering and moving slowly and noiselessly, for example, such as the wave of reports in Belgium in 1989. Now, this is a drawing made by one of the purported witnesses in that wave of sightings from the archives of something called SOBEPS, which is a Belgian UFO investigation group at the time, and it was reproduced in Leslie Kane's 2010 book. This wave of sightings is, okay, you're going to hate me for this, most likely explicable as a kind of mass delusion, as you're probably aware. But as I mentioned, under the assumption that these movements are real, we can treat them and ask how they're physically possible. Physically, the hovering behaviors aren't too troubling to me, provided the objects aren't too large. But for the sake of time, in fact, I have less than I thought I did, I'll skip this and we can discuss it afterward. The hovering doesn't bother me too much. We can trust me, I have lots more to say, but I don't have time for this. Yeah. So another kind of observation or behavior I've seen described has been that of glowing orbs, not too large, perhaps basketball-sized, of various colors that hover and move in the air and sometimes pass through physical objects. Now, these are a bit harder to approach with a scientist's or a physicist's perspective because when I encounter a description like this, I think of a modern light show, or I think of various kinds of human misperceptions or hallucinations, or frankly, I think that these descriptions are quite too close to common descriptions of ghosts and the paranormal, too close to be subject to rigorous definition and experiment, and also a class of reports for which convincing evidence doesn't exist, which are usually explicable by quotidian phenomena. More interesting are the reports of larger objects on the meter scale, or few meters scale, or sometimes tens of meters scale. I lived in Europe for 10 years, so I think in meters. Also physicists think in meters. Moving in extreme ways. So a good example of this is the so-called Nimitz event from November of 2004, exactly 20 years ago this month. So personnel of the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group operating off the coast of Southern California reportedly observed and investigated unusual aircraft over the course of 2 weeks or so. For us, the most important extreme physical behaviors reported were that attributed to a 46-foot-long, smooth white oval object shaped a bit like a tic-tac mint or an elongated egg, crucially, uniformly covered with no nacelles, pylons, or wings, according to one report. Now, this tic-tac or objects like it was reportedly performing wild maneuvers, such as the following: hovering at an altitude of 80,000 or 60,000 feet before dropping to 50 feet above the ocean, reportedly in a fraction of a second or a matter of seconds, depending upon the report. Also making spontaneous right-angle turns at high speeds, traveling horizontally at high speeds, extreme speeds, and immediately accelerating to extreme speeds. Now, these kinds of extreme behaviors are also reported in many other UAP reports, as many of you know, and also we heard a little bit about them yesterday, for example. So, such as the Belgian wave I mentioned, as well as, for example, in the 1976 Tehran report, where a sizable craft was described as jumping large distances in an instant, and even going back to the beginning of the modern UAP era, when in 1948, with the Eastern Airlines DC-3 cigar-shaped light. And there are many other reports that feature similar substantial objects moving in extreme ways. Now, it doesn't take a physicist from CERN to tell you that these movements make very little sense for a macroscopic object in Earth's atmosphere. So using the tic-tac, the Nimitz tic-tac as an example, and considering solely the first behavior, this drop, even assuming the object was at 60,000 feet and dropped to 50 feet within, say, 2 seconds, this is in fact 30,000 feet per second, which is more than 20,000 miles per hour. So our fastest known craft can't exceed or can't achieve these speeds, nor can they achieve anything remotely like seemingly immediate acceleration or deceleration, and none of them lack nacelles, pylons, or wings. They have extremely sophisticated shapes and designs. So we're left with a couple of possible conclusions. The first is not so sexy. Optical illusion or measurement error. Don't throw tomatoes. Optical illusions can indeed move like this. We have to admit that. The second possible conclusion, though, is that such objects represent technology quite distinct from existing atmospheric propulsion and maneuverability systems used today. All of our current systems are reaction drives requiring engines or some other method of providing thrust by sending something in one direction so that the craft can move in the opposite direction, obeying the laws of physics. So for the Tic Tac, for example, had no apparent engines or thrust or exhaust, and achieving extremely high speeds and immediate acceleration isn't possible with current atmospheric propulsion systems, at least those that I'm aware of. So moving macroscopic objects, human-scale objects, around in conventional ways still requires one to obey Newtonian physics. So we're still left considering speculative propulsion and maneuverability systems. So when we consider speculative or beyond the horizon systems, keep in mind that whatever system it is needs to provide a large amount of energy to achieve what some UAP reportedly achieve. So for example, in the case of the Nimitz Tic Tac, we can make some assumptions just for fun, and we can see if perhaps standard nuclear fission power could potentially account for the energy needed. So for the mass of an F-16, for example, is in the 10,000 kilograms range. So let's just assume that the Tic Tac, 46 feet long, and some Tic Tac-like height and width, I don't know what that is, and an advanced craft that has half that mass, is an advanced craft that has half that mass, 5,000 kilograms. And let's further ignore acceleration from Earth's gravity in case it weren't obvious. Free fall itself can't account for this movement, as it would take this craft more than a minute to fall that distance, and it would only reach about 900 miles per hour, and it would crash directly into the ocean. Let's further assume that the immediate acceleration reported was actually something quite quick, but non-zero. So let's assume that the movement looked something like this. The craft started from rest and it moved from rest. It went from 60,000 foot altitude to a 50-foot altitude in 2 seconds. And let's say that it moved from rest to 20,000 miles per hour in half a second, traveled at a constant speed for 1 second, and then slowed down to a rest at 50-foot altitude in the last half a second. So for a Tic Tac like this, it would require an energy on the scale of something like 90 megajoules, and the final deceleration would take the same. So this is, of course, equivalent to a power source of about 180 megawatts. So as a side note, for the Tic Tac, this is also more than 1,800 G. So for the aviation people in the audience, perhaps that's a bit scary, because that would quite handily pancakeify humans inside. Now, this 180 megawatts is not super large, but it's, because, for example, it's in the range of power produced by these small, compact, modular fission reactors, such as those planned and designed by companies like NuScale here in the US and already in use in China and Russia. And I'll just skip this because for time, but just suffice it to say, in principle, you might be able to pack some fission reactors into a little Tic Tac with some re-engineering. Probably not, though. So because fission, you'd still have some kind of exhaust, you'd need some thrust, and this would be detectable. There's also a lot of radiation that was not reported for the Tic Tac. So fission probably won't work. So how about antimatter? Matter-antimatter annihilation can indeed, in principle, produce a large amount of energy quite efficiently, because 100% of the mass of the matter and antimatter that annihilate is converted into energy. Now, there are a lot of speculations and currently unsolved issues in this realm, however. For example, creating quantities usable as an energy source is extremely hard. We can and do make antimatter at CERN, for example. In fact, we have an antimatter factory. Do you have one of those at your work? But in tiny quantities for fundamental research, not collection, and not, as mentioned, to make a bomb to blow up the Vatican. Thank you, Dan Brown. Oh, Dan Brown. And by tiny, I mean minuscule. If we used all of our accelerators only for making antimatter, we could produce about 1/1000th of a gram per year to make enough antimatter to achieve the energy needed for the immediate acceleration of the Tic Tac one time. We'd thus need to run all of CERN's accelerators to only make antimatter for about 1,000 years. So antimatter is extremely inefficient to produce, and there are major challenges in storage of even a little pellet of antihydrogen, and using it for a drive would still emit large amounts of heat and radiation not observed with the Tic Tac. So it's difficult to think that the Tic Tac could be antimatter powered. For the sake of time, I'm just going to say, what about fusion? Probably not. Again, we can talk about this afterwards. It's still decades away, would still emit exhaust. So, after all of this, we're really only left with one possible known set of physical phenomena that could even in principle account for the physical movements reported. Now, this has something to do, of course, with the bending and curving of space-time. Once we say those words, the second we say those words, however, we're immediately into speculative territory. One of the key conceptual insights of general relativity, as you know, is that space itself is not just nothing. Space has a kind of stuffness to it. It can bend, warp, and flow relative to other points in space. And gravity as a force arises due to the fact that the presence of a certain amount of stuff within a volume of space creates a kind of sinkhole in space itself. And the more stuff you pack into a volume, the more space bends and flows toward the center of that volume until eventually, if you pack too much stuff into a fixed volume, the space will be flowing toward the center of that volume faster than the speed of light. And this, of course, is a black hole. So many of you know where I'm going with this, but back in the 90s, a physicist named Miguel Alcubierre noticed that, in principle, general relativity might allow you to make a bubble in space around which a bubble in space around an object like a craft, for example, and for a region in front of your bubble, you bunch up the fabric of space. Simultaneously behind the bubble, you cause the fabric of space to expand, sort of a controllable black hole in front of you and a controllable white hole behind you. And within this bubble, you don't move, and so you don't break the laws of physics. But to an outside observer, your bubble has no choice but to change positions relative to peripheral points. And once you stop this forward bunching and rear expansion, your position has drastically changed compared to where it was, and you could potentially arrive at some faraway destination in a fraction of the time a conventional drive would take to arrive there. So obviously, this would be remarkably useful, and for our purposes, this would very handily explain the behaviors and movements of many reported UAP. An ideal kind of warp drive is not a reaction drive, so it wouldn't emit exhaust or standard engines or use standard engines or fuels. And it's not really even a propulsion system in the sense that one can convince oneself that it's not really a method of moving through space. It's a method of manipulating the fabric of space itself while you stay put in your chair. Within this bubble, the craft doesn't move, so the craft wouldn't necessarily need nacelles, pylons, or wings. It could be a simple, smooth, elongated egg. The problem is that the original version of an Alcubierre drive seems rather impossible for a few reasons. One of which is that it might require something called exotic matter having a property known as negative energy density that you need in extremely large quantities, equivalent to, for example, the rest mass of the entire universe. These, as you might agree, are rather big drawbacks. However, physicists have been thinking about this since the 90s, and it seems that with a few changes, it might indeed be possible to create physical warp drives. Now, for these purposes, I direct you only to a paper from a few years ago by Alexei Bobrik and Gianni Martira, appropriately titled Introducing Physical Warp Drives, but in fact, there's been quite a bit of thought in this direction over the past few years. So for our purposes, in principle, it could be possible to explain the more extreme behaviors and movements of some of the objects in some UAP reports, here exemplified by the Nimitz tic-tac, but not exclusive to that, if these objects were moving around via some kind of warp drive. And as far as I know, there's really nothing else that could reasonably explain these reported movements. However, no warp drives currently exist. They are all purely theoretical speculation at this point. And as I mentioned, I'm an experimentalist. Show me the experiment. Show me the data. I can't assent to the reality of something without data, without experiment, without something tangible. And the thing you should not take away from this talk is that James from CERN said that UAP are warp drive craft. That is not the statement. Because frankly, there are enormous problems, theoretical, experimental, and technical, that need to be addressed before I could ever assent to the reality of some idea, of the idea that some UAP could be real objects maneuvering via warp drive. So, as I said, the second part of why I'm here is to give my thoughts on what I would propose for a robust scientific study of UAP and what that means to me. Yeah, we went through that already. So first, the broader scientific community needs more and better data. Until we have physical objects to study and clear, repeated, unambiguous visual data, there's very little that can be done. Let's not forget where the burden of proof lies here. It's not the scientific community's responsibility to formulate detailed explanations for reports of UAP behavior that at this point are in the category of hearsay and conjecture. The broader scientific community is not the one making the existence claim. The burden of proof is upon those making the existence claims to provide clear evidence for these reported phenomena. And if that evidence is vague or unconvincing, then so be it. The production of clear data and objects should be the top, #1 goal with a laser focus. Second, under the assumption that clear, robust data can be provided en masse and without qualification or restriction, warp drive research should be accelerated, and not just secret military research that we don't know about, but open research on the topics that underpin warp drive concepts, general relativity and quantum mechanics. So here's the thing. Many of the theories that suggest warp drives and the possible requirements to make one feasible rest upon an assumption that is currently experimentally unverified, that general relativity is valid in some way down to tiny quantum level length scales. This is in fact experimentally unknown. There are several theoretical models of quantum gravity, string theory perhaps the most famous among others, but until we can experimentally distinguish among them, we'll simply never know how and whether quantum mechanics and general relativity work together. And for our purposes, whether a warp drive is a physically real possibility. And in fact, we know what kind of experiment to perform to determine this, and it comes back to my field, collider physics. Also, we can talk about Casimir effect later if you want to. So the Large Hadron Collider is large, and collider experiments in general are large because we need a lot of distance to accelerate particles like protons to high kinetic energies, E, to be able to see if new particles or phenomena like Higgs bosons or miniature black holes with masses m exist waiting to be discovered. But think about it. If the universe has a particle or a phenomenon, one that was perhaps prevalent back at the moment of the Big Bang when the universe was much hotter and much more energetic than it is today, but not prevalent now, and that particle has a mass m up here, something high, and we as a species have only ever built a collider with energy E, we'll simply never be able to produce this particle or phenomenon in abundance and measure its properties. So we suspect that far back at the moment of the Big Bang, some kind of quantum gravity existed. And in the current universe, where the place where these two theories collide is in a black hole. So if we could make a miniature black hole factory, this would solve everything. So the bigger the collider, the higher the energy, until eventually you reach a kind of ultimate energy, the Planck energy. This is the energy at which gravity and quantum mechanics must have something to do with each other, even if we don't know what that is. And it's the energy at which we would be able to create miniature black holes and see if quantum gravity exists, and thus potentially teach ourselves enough to be able to construct a physical warp drive if it's even possible. We can't reach the Planck energy and make black holes at the Large Hadron Collider. We checked. There's nothing there. We probably can't make miniature black holes at the proposed successor to the Large Hadron Collider, the Future Circular Collider. Presumably when the future becomes the present, we'll change the name. Either. We probably can't even make miniature black holes in a circular collider on the moon to reach energies 1,000 times those of the Large Hadron Collider. I know this because I published a paper proposing this a few years ago. No, to reach the Planck energy, by some estimates, we need to build a collider that circles around the outer orbit of Neptune. However, my colleague Frank thinks this might be pessimistic, and we have a paper in preparation about this right now, and that we might be able to achieve this on a much smaller scale with a collider that circles the sun about 1/10 of the distance between the Earth and the sun. Modest by comparison, but such a machine would still require some major innovation to construct. But this is how we could answer these questions definitively. To achieve this, of course, we need advancements, as I mentioned, in magnet technology, in situ space construction, etc. Additionally, some of you might be wondering whether we just need new kinds of particle acceleration technology. And this is true. Some alternative methods of potentially accelerating particles to higher speeds and energies within smaller distances are currently being studied. And if we could find others, this would allow us to make a much more modestly sized black hole factory, perhaps on the Earth or the Moon. So this is what is needed from an experimental standpoint to finally understand general relativity, quantum mechanics, and their possible connection to be able to construct a warp drive. So I'm wrapping up, I promise, here for those that want me to move on. Finally, in the absence of this robust, unambiguous data for UAP exhibiting extreme movements, such as the Nimitz tic-tac, and in the absence of any technologically feasible concept for a physical warp drive, a drive that could really only possibly be constructed if we have a full and complete understanding of quantum gravity, in the absence of these two things, I am left with the current conclusion that such UAP will most likely be explicable by known objects or phenomena. So again, 30 seconds here and I'm done, maybe 60 seconds. I hope that I've made it clear that my role here is not as a naysayer or as a curmudgeon, but as a scientist who, of course, supports the scientific study of anomalous phenomena. All scientists should do so. And I think you realize now that I'm not a scientifically conservative and risk-averse researcher. I published a paper about building a particle collider on the moon, and I want to build a black hole factory circling the sun. I love the edges of science. But I hope I've also outlined what I see as a few impediments to the goal of a broad global scientific UAP program. Some of the main conclusions or hypotheses that I often encounter within UAP realm do not follow from the data and observations we in the broader scientific community have access to. And focusing the scope of UAP discussions on, say, as was discussed many times, aviation safety or defense security, advanced surveillance capabilities of governments around the world, that would be a major benefit. So my two main recommendations, just to finish, are, where are we here? Is that we need clear, repetitive visual and physical data, and number two, that warp drive research should be accelerated, which, as discussed, would be simply great for fundamental physics, irrespective of the applications to possible UAP research. So again, regarding that first one, there's very little to be done scientifically until it exists. If a student comes to me and says, Dr. Beacham, I've discovered a new particle in Large Hadron Collider data, I would not call a press conference. I would ask them to show me what they found, and I would inspect their claims in detail for months, along with thousands of my colleagues. And if they told me, no, I can't show you the detail, but I definitely saw it, then unfortunately, there's very little to be done, and the claim won't go anywhere. And so now it's entirely possible that, for example, an ET visitation might happen tomorrow. That would, of course, be the most amazing thing that's ever happened in the history of humanity. But even if that happened, it would not negate what I'm saying here. We have to insist upon this kind of rigorous scientific attitude toward things, because otherwise we'll make mistakes. The history of science is filled with people who manage to delude themselves, because I don't know if you noticed this, we humans are exceptionally good at allowing self-delusion. We're very, very good at it. And so I would like to think, yes, please, come. I would like to think that it would not take something as momentous and earth-shaking as an obvious ET visitation, or a visitation from Mara here, to realize that the things that we have in common are much stronger than those things that people try to divide us with. But it might actually take this. And so I would just leave you with the thought that I think that for me, whether or not there is a kind of ET hypothesis to entertain, for me, we have to confront the possibility that we're completely alone in the universe, and we might have to confront the possibility that we, right here, have to take care of each other. Thanks.
Thank you so much, James.